The chestnut mare arrived at Wilhelmina Vaughn's fence post on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1882, standing there as calmly as if she'd been invited, her reins dragging in the red Oklahoma dirt and her dark eyes blinking slow and easy in the early light. Wilhelmina heard her before she saw her. She was kneeling in the small vegetable patch beside the house, pressing the last of the season's turnip seeds into the dry earth with her thumb, when she heard the soft huff and the clop of a hoof against the hard ground near the road. She stood and turned, pressing one hand over her eyes to block the rising sun, and saw the horse standing there alone, no rider, no wagon, just a beautiful animal with a brand on her left haunch that Wilhelmina did not recognize. She was 24 years old and had lived on this quarter section of land just south of the town of Danvers for 2 years, ever since her father passed from a fever and left her the place and the deed and a small amount of cash that had since dwindled to nearly nothing. She knew horses. Her father had kept 4 of them at one time. She knew enough to see that this one was well fed, well shod, and not a range horse gone wild. Someone owned this animal and was probably already looking for her. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron and walked to the fence. The mare turned her great head and regarded Wilhelmina with an expression that was almost sociable. "Where did you come from?" Wilhelmina said, not as a question, but as a sort of statement of wonder. She reached over the top rail and let the horse smell the back of her hand. The mare sniffed, blew a warm breath across Wilhelmina's knuckles, and allowed the touch when Wilhelmina stroked the long bridge of her nose. She examined the brand. It was a simple shape, like 2 letters pressed together, what looked like an N with a small hook at the top left corner. She had not seen that mark before. She looked down the road in both directions. Nothing. No dust cloud of a rider coming. No tracks except the mare's own that seemed to come from the northeast, from the direction of the ridge and the open pasture country beyond it. Wilhelmina led her through the gate, tied her at the post near the well, and gave her a bucket of water and a scoop of the oats she kept for her own old gelding named Fletcher. Then she went inside and made herself breakfast and thought about what to do. The town of Danvers was 5 miles south. She could take the horse there, ask at the livery if anyone had reported a missing animal. She could also ride out northeast and see if there was a ranch up that way she had simply not known about. She had not been up beyond the ridge herself. She had been occupied for 2 years with simply keeping her land and her small household going, which was a full-time occupation for a woman alone. After breakfast, she decided to ride northeast. She saddled Fletcher, tied the mare's reins to her own saddle horn, and rode out into the clear morning. The land beyond the ridge opened up in a way that surprised her. She had expected more of the same dry scrub and shallow gully country that bordered her own land, but past the crest of the ridge the terrain rolled out into proper grassland, golden and wide, and she could see at a distance of perhaps 3 miles a cluster of buildings that had to be a working ranch. There was a barn, a main house, a long low bunkhouse running parallel to a fence line, and several horses visible in a paddock even from this distance. She rode toward it. As she got closer, she could see the details filling in, the way a picture comes clear when you walk toward it. The barn was painted red, or had been once, and the paint was weathered to a dull rust color now. The main house was modest but solid, built of timber with a covered porch running along the front. There were chickens in the yard and a dog sleeping in the shade of the porch steps. The dog lifted its head when she rode through the open gate at the end of the approach road and barked once, and then lowered its head again as if it had satisfied some obligation. A man came out of the barn. He was not what she expected, though she had not been expecting anything in particular. He was maybe 28 or so, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of sun-weathered skin that comes from years of working outdoors. He wore canvas trousers and a collarless shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and he had a hammer in his hand that he'd clearly been using just a moment before. He stopped when he saw the 2 horses and the woman riding one, and his eyes went straight to the mare the way a man's eyes go to something he has been worrying about. "That's Clover," he said, crossing the yard to her. I found her at my fence this morning, Wilhelmina said. The brand looked like yours, or what I guessed was yours. I am Wilhelmina Vaughn. I have the quarter section south of the ridge. He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat, which was pushed back on his head in the casual way of a man on his own property. His eyes were an unusual color, something between gray and green, and they were direct and clear. Ira Norris, he said. He reached up and took Clover's lead rope from Wilhelmina's saddle horn and ran a hand down the mare's neck, checking her over with quick, efficient movements. She got out 2 days ago. I have been half expecting to find her drowned in a creek somewhere. He looked back up at Wilhelmina. Thank you for bringing her back. That was a long ride for a kindness to a stranger. It was not so long, Wilhelmina said, 5 miles at most. Still, he looked at her with something thoughtful in his expression. I would not have expected the favor. Will you come in? I could offer you coffee and at least something to eat before you ride back. She should have said no. She had things to do. The turnips needed covering, and there was a loose board in the chicken coop that Fletcher had been noticing with suspicious interest for a week. But the morning was still early, and the ride had given her an appetite, and she had not sat at another person's table in longer than she cared to count. Coffee would be welcome, she said, and dismounted. She tied Fletcher at the porch rail, and followed Ira up the steps and into the house. It was clean in the way that a bachelor's house is clean when the man in question takes some pride in himself, which is to say it was organized and free of actual dirt, but missing the touches that a woman's hand brings, the curtain at the window, the cloth on the table, the small things that make a house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. There was a wood stove in the kitchen and a good iron coffee pot already on it. He poured 2 cups and set bread and butter on the table and sat across from her. How long have you been on the South Quarter? He asked. 2 years, she said. My father left it to me. He died of fever in the spring of '80. I am sorry. He had a good life, she said. It was the thing she always said because it was true and because saying it kept the grief at a manageable distance. What are you running out there? Cattle. I had 2 cattle, but I sold them last winter when the money ran low. Mostly I keep a garden and trade vegetables in town. I have a few chickens. I do some sewing for hire. He nodded as if this was not strange to him. It is hard to run a place alone. Yes, she said. It is. There was a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. He refilled her cup without being asked. The ranch has been mine for 3 years, he said. I worked for other men for 10 years before that. Trail drives mostly, then a stint as a ranch hand up in Kansas. I saved enough to buy this land from a man who was heading back east with his tail between his legs. Do you have help? She asked. 2 hands. Brothers named Cleet and Dix Farrow. Good workers. He paused. It is still a lot of land for 3 men. She ate the bread and drank the coffee and told herself she was not looking at him the way she was looking at him, which was with a certain quality of attention she had not given to anyone in a long time. He was not conventionally handsome, but his face was the kind that improved the longer you looked at it. There was something settled about him, something that did not have the fidgety quality of men who were always looking past the present moment toward the next one. When she stood to go, he walked her out to the porch. Keep the mare, he said. She stopped with her hand on Fletcher's saddle and turned to look at him. I beg your pardon. Keep Clover, he said. He was leaning against the porch post with his arms folded, and there was something careful in his expression, as if he was choosing his words with more attention than the simple statement required. She is young and sound, and you said you only have the 1 horse. She would be useful to you. Wilhelmina looked at the mare, who was standing beside Fletcher with the companionable ease of 2 animals that have already decided they like each other. She looked back at Ira. That is not a small gift, she said. A horse like that is worth $30 at least. I know what she is worth. Then tell me why, Wilhelmina said. Why would you give a valuable horse to a woman you met half an hour ago? He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was full now, coming warm and gold across the grass, and somewhere out in the paddock, one of the other horses called and was answered. Because, he said slowly, I want a reason to come for her." Wilhelmina looked at him a long time. His expression was steady and open and just honest enough to make her chest do something inconvenient. "You could simply come to call," she said. "A man needs a reason," he said. "Out here, a man does not simply go calling. It seems presumptuous. And leaving a horse at my place does not." The corner of his mouth moved. "It is a different kind of presumptuous." She considered him. She considered the mare. She considered the fact that she had ridden 5 miles to return this horse to a man, who was now standing on his porch, giving it back to her, with what amounted to the most oblique expression of interest she had ever encountered. And she found that she was not at all displeased. "All right," she said. "I will keep her for now. But she is alone, Ira Norris, until you make good on your word." "That is entirely fair," he said. She mounted Fletcher and took Clover's lead rope and rode back toward the ridge without looking over her shoulder, though she was aware in that particular alert way of the body that he watched her until she was over the crest and out of sight. The weeks that followed were a kind of quiet courtship conducted in the language of practical necessity, which was how most things were conducted on the frontier in the year 1882, because life did not pause for sentiment, and neither could the people living it. Ira came to her place for the first time 6 days after she had returned his horse. He rode up in the middle of the afternoon on a bay gelding and found her on the roof of the chicken coop with a hammer and a box of nails. He stood in the yard and looked up at her. "I told you there was a loose board," she explained, without preamble, as if they had already been in conversation. "I can see that," he said. "Do you want help?" "I am nearly finished," she said, "but you could hold the ladder." He held the ladder. She finished the repair and came down, and they stood in the yard in the warm afternoon, the chickens performing their endless investigation of the ground around them. "I came to see how Clover is doing," he said. "She is doing beautifully," Wilhelmina said. "She and Fletcher have become great friends, which is more than I can say for Fletcher and the chickens." She paused. "Would you like to see her?" They walked to the small pasture behind the house together and stood at the fence watching the 2 horses. Clover was grazing with the leisurely confidence of an animal that knows it is well placed. Wilhelmina felt the warmth of him beside her, close enough that she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. "She seems content," he said. "She is," Wilhelmina said. "She is a good horse, Ira. She deserves better than being given away on a stranger's doorstep." "I did not give her away," he said. "I lent her." "So you said." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I was wondering if you would come to supper on Saturday. Cleet's wife Nora cooks for the ranch on weekends. She is a fine cook and would not mind the company. I thought it might be more comfortable than just the 2 of us." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the horses. "That is very considerate of you," she said. "I try," he said. "She went to supper on Saturday." Nora Farrow was a stout, good-humored woman of 30 with red hands and a laugh like a hinge in need of oil, and she took one look at Wilhelmina and another look at Ira, and clearly drew her own conclusions, after which she proceeded to be extraordinarily warm to Wilhelmina for the rest of the evening. Dix Farrow was the younger of the 2 brothers, 20 or so, quiet and observant, and he spent most of supper studying his plate with the focus of a man solving a difficult problem. Cleet was boisterous and told stories about trail drives that grew more elaborate as the evening went on, until Nora told him to stop before he talked himself into a canyon. Ira sat across from Wilhelmina and was attentive in the way of a man who is genuinely interested and is trying not to make it too obvious, which makes it, of course, extremely obvious. He filled her coffee cup before she asked. He listened when she spoke with the full quality of his attention, not the half-listening that people do when they are only waiting for their turn to speak. After supper he walked her out to the horses in the dark and held her stirrup while she mounted, which she did not strictly need but accepted without comment. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking me," she said. There was a moon 3/4 full and it made the grass silver. She could see his face tilted up toward her, the line of his jaw, the pale light catching his eyes. "I will ride out your way Thursday," he said. "If that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. She rode home through the silver grass and allowed herself, once she was well over the ridge and alone, to smile quite freely at nothing in particular. October came in cool and windy, and the visits continued with a regularity that Wilhelmina found she had begun to depend on in a way she was not entirely comfortable admitting to herself. He came Thursday, as promised. Then the following Monday he came unannounced to help her clear the irrigation ditch behind the garden that had been blocked up since summer. She had not asked for help. He arrived with a shovel and said only that Cleet had mentioned she had drainage trouble, which meant Nora had mentioned it, which meant Nora had asked about it, which meant he had been talking about Wilhelmina to Nora in a way that made it worthwhile for Nora to go gathering information. She did not mention any of this to him. She got her own shovel, and they worked side by side for most of the morning. Working alongside him was easy in a way that she had not anticipated. He did not try to take over the work from her or suggest she was not doing it correctly. He simply worked, and when they reached the blockage and it required combined effort, they combined effort without discussion and got it done. When the water finally moved through clean and free, he straightened up and looked at it with the same satisfaction she felt, the satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. They ate lunch on the porch steps, bread and cold beans from her kitchen, and talked about things that mattered to them both: the dry year they'd had and what it might mean for next spring's planting, the railroad expansion that was supposed to reach Danver within 2 years and what that would do to land prices, the way the prairie hawk population seemed to have declined since she'd been here, and whether that had something to do with the cattle herds moving through. He had opinions on all of it. They were good opinions, considered and informed, and he was not precious about them. When she disagreed, he listened to her disagreement with real interest and sometimes changed his position and sometimes didn't, but always explained his reasoning, which she found more satisfying than simple agreement. "You are unusual," she told him at some point in the middle of all this. He looked at her with a mild expression. "In what way?" "You argue honestly," she said. "Most men argue to win. You argue to find out what is true." He considered this. "My father was a minister," he said. He argued the same way. He said that any man who needed to win an argument in order to maintain his position was a man who did not actually believe his own position. He paused. "I did not agree with him about much, but I agreed about that." "Did you not get on with your father?" "We got on well enough," he said. "He wanted me to follow him into ministry. I was not called in that direction. That was a point of sadness between us for a long time. He died before we fully made our peace with it." He said this simply, without dramatizing it, but she heard the weight of it. "I understand that," she said. "The unfinished thing." He looked at her. "Your father." "He wanted me to marry before he died," she said. "There was a man he had in mind, a merchant from Wichita, reasonable man, I suppose, kind enough. I could not do it." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that. "Because he was adequate," she said finally, "and I think I would rather be alone than be with someone adequate." Ira was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That seems right to me." There was a quality to the silence after that that felt different from other silences. She was very aware of him sitting there beside her on the step, the warmth of him against the cool October air, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "I should be getting back," he said, and stood, and she was aware of a peculiar disappointment at the absence of that warmth even while she knew it was the sensible thing. He came again the following week, and the week after that, and each time there was more ease between them and also more tension, because ease between two people who are drawn to each other does not reduce the tension, but rather heightens it, winds it tighter, until the whole thing has the quality of a string on a fiddle that wants to be played. In November, a cold front came through that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek and made the mornings hard with frost. Wilhelmina had been putting up her winter stores, and she had done well enough that she was not worried about the lean months ahead. But there were things she needed from town, and she rode to Danver on a Wednesday morning to get them, with Clover under her for the first time on a proper errand, and the mare performing beautifully. Denver was a small town in the way that most towns in that part of Oklahoma Territory were small in 1882, which is to say it had what was necessary and not much else. There was a general store, a post office, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a barber, a doctor who was also the dentist, a saloon, and a small church that served 3 denominations on a rotating schedule, because there was only enough congregation to keep one building heated. There was also a land office, which was busy because the territory was still sorting itself out and would be for years yet, and a small schoolhouse that stood at the edge of town and served the children of the surrounding farms and ranches. She was at the general store loading her saddlebags when she heard her name spoken by a man she did not know. "You are Wilhelmina Vaughn, are you not?" "The woman with the quarter section south of the ridge," she turned. The man was about 40, well-dressed by local standards, with the smooth face of someone who worked indoors. He wore a black coat and a hat with a narrow brim, and he had the particular quality of stillness of someone who is very certain of their own importance. "I am," she said. "My name is Gerald Hatch," he said. "I represent a land development company out of Kansas City. I have been looking at a number of properties in this area with a view to purchase. Yours is among them." She looked at him steadily. "My land is not for sale, Mr. Hatch. I have not yet made an offer," he said pleasantly. "I think you might find the terms quite generous. The company I represent is prepared to offer well above the assessed value." "It does not matter," she said. "It was my father's land and it will be my land, and I am not selling it." Something moved briefly in his expression, some adjustment of calculation, before the pleasantness returned. "I understand sentiment, Miss Vaughn, but sentiment can be a costly luxury on the frontier. I wonder if you would at least allow me to present the offer formally." "No," she said, "I would not. I wish you a good day, Mr. Hatch." She finished loading her saddlebags and left. But the encounter left a residue of unease that she carried home with her and could not quite shake off. She mentioned it to Ira when he rode over 2 days later. He listened without interruption, which was his way, and his expression grew quiet and thoughtful in the way it did when he was taking something seriously. "Hatch," he said. "I know that name. He came to see me last month. I sent him off similarly. He is buying up land in the area." "Trying to," Ira said. "There is money moving through this territory right now, with the railroad coming. Men like Hatch get ahead of the railroad and buy cheap and sell high when the station goes in and the land value jumps." He paused. "He is not dangerous in the way of an outlaw, but he is the kind of man who does not take no for an answer. He will come back." "Let him," she said. Ira looked at her with something in his expression that might have been admiration. "You are not worried." "I am practical," she said. "Worry accomplishes nothing. If he comes back I will say no again, and again after that if necessary." He nodded slowly. "You are remarkable, Wilhelmina." The word landed so simply and directly that she felt it through her whole chest, a warmth spreading outward from the center of her. She had been called practical before, and capable and stubborn, and once or twice, with less approval, unusual. She had not been called remarkable, not by anyone who meant it the way he clearly meant it. "You say that as if it surprises you," she said, to cover the warmth. "It does," he said honestly. "Most things about you surprise me." She looked at him. He looked back. They were standing in her kitchen where she had been making bread when he arrived, and there was flour on her hands, and the room smelled of the warm yeast and wheat smell that is one of the most domestic and comforting of all smells, and something about all of it combined, the warmth, the smell, the directness of his gaze, the honesty of him, made her set down the bread dough and cross the space between them and stand close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. "Ira," she said. He looked at her with an expression of careful, almost painful attention, as if he was afraid of misreading something. "May I?" she said, and then did not finish the sentence, and he understood the unfinished thing and bent his head and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. Neither of them was tentative by nature. It was a real kiss, warm and certain, and it lasted long enough to be meaningful, and then they stepped back from each other and looked at each other with the particular look of two people who have just done something that cannot be undone and are discovering that they are glad about it. "I have wanted to do that since you came down off that chicken coop," he said. A laugh escaped her, genuine and warm. "That is a very specific piece of information." "I am a specific kind of man," he said. She picked up her bread dough again because it needed to be done, and he sat at her table, and they talked for another hour while she worked, and the afternoon light moved across the floor in its slow autumn way. And Wilhelmina thought that this was what happiness felt like when it was not performing itself for an audience but simply existing quietly in a kitchen on a Friday afternoon. Gerald Hatch came back, as Ira had predicted. He came on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, and this time he brought a document, a formal purchase offer printed on company letterhead, which he presented to Wilhelmina at her front door with the air of a man delivering good news. She read it carefully. He had offered $140 for the quarter section, which was somewhat above assessed value but not dramatically so. "No," she said, and handed it back. His pleasantness frayed slightly at the edges. "Miss Vaughn, I encourage you to consider the position you are in. You are a single woman operating this land alone. There are challenges ahead that you may not have fully accounted for. The drought conditions, the soil quality in this area. I am familiar with the drought conditions and the soil quality," she said. "They are my drought conditions and my soil quality. Good morning, Mr. Hatch." She closed the door. She told Ira that same afternoon when he came by, and she saw something tight and controlled move through his expression. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," she said. "He suggested that challenges lay ahead that I had not accounted for. It was meant to sound like helpful advice, but it was a threat of a sort." "I do not like this," Ira said. "Neither do I," she said, "but I am not frightened of him." "That is fine," he said, "but you should not have to manage him alone. If he comes again, send to me." She looked at him carefully. "I do not need rescuing, Ira." "I know you do not," he said with complete directness, "but you deserve someone in your corner. That is a different thing entirely." She could not argue with that distinction because it was a true one. Hatch came a third time, 2 weeks later, and this time he was not alone. He had a man with him, larger and harder-faced, the kind of man who is present for a specific kind of persuasion. They came in the early evening when the light was going and found Wilhelmina, unfortunately for them, not alone. Ira was there, having come to help her repair the fence on the north side of her property that had been pushed down by a small deer herd moving through. Hatch saw Ira and adjusted. He was smooth about it, pivoting to a more conciliatory tone, but the large man behind him did not entirely mask his recalibration. "Miss Vaughn," Hatch said pleasantly, "I was hoping to catch you at a better time." "This is a fine time," Ira said from where he was standing at the fence. He did not move toward them, but his voice carried a quality of calm that was not quite friendliness. "What is your business here?" "My business is with Miss Vaughn," Hatch said. "Miss Vaughn has heard your business twice already," Ira said. "She has given you her answer twice." "I am not sure this concerns you," Hatch said. "Anything that concerns Wilhelmina Vaughn concerns me," Ira said. Still that same calm. Not a threat precisely, but not nothing either. Hatch looked between them and made his calculation and evidently decided the return was not worth the cost. He gave Wilhelmina a last pleasant look that did not reach his eyes. "I hope you will reconsider at some point, Miss Vaughn. Good evening." They rode away. Wilhelmina watched them go and then looked at Ira. "Anything that concerns me concerns you," she said. He met her eyes without flinching. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. "You are going to have to be more specific than that, Ira Norris." He set down his fence pliers and walked toward her across the dry grass and stopped in front of her. The evening sky behind him was going red and orange in the way that the Oklahoma sky does in November, spectacular and vast and indifferent to human concerns. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it. I would like to come here as a man who intends more than just visiting." He paused. "I am trying to say that I have thought of little besides you since September, and I would like the right to say that your concerns are my concerns and mean it with full clarity." The honesty of it, the plain, direct honesty, hit her like warm water. She had expected him to find a more complicated way of saying it, some approach that kept a door open for retreat. He had not. "Yes," she said, "I will allow it." He nodded, as if something had been settled. He picked his pliers back up and went back to the fence. She stood there for a moment more, looking at the red sky, feeling that particular quality of aliveness that comes when something has shifted in a direction that is right and true, and then she went back to help him with the fence. The courtship was conducted with the same practical warmth that seemed to characterize everything between them. He came regularly, and they worked together on her place and on his, and there were evenings at the table with coffee and conversation, and there were the increasingly frequent and quite wonderful occasions when he kissed her in the way he had kissed her that first time, as if it was both certain and a gift. Nora Farrow treated Wilhelmina with a proprietary warmth, claiming credit for the match on the grounds that her supper invitation had been the decisive occasion, which was not strictly accurate, but was also not entirely inaccurate. December came cold and clear and beautiful, the kind of winter that the territory did from time to time, as if in apology for the summers. The grass went silver with frost every morning, and the sky was a hard blue that made everything look like it had been painted rather than simply existing. Wilhelmina had her stores in and her horses stabled, and a good supply of firewood, and she felt, for the first time since she had been alone on this land, something that was not merely surviving but actually living. She rode to his place for Christmas, which Nora had organized with characteristic force into a proper celebration. There were a dozen people around the long table, neighbors from ranches to the north, Cleet's family, which included 3 children who ran continuously and with great purpose, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Pickett who lived alone 4 miles east and whom Nora had collected for the occasion. Ira sat beside Wilhelmina at supper, and at some point during the meal his hand found hers under the table and held it, and she did not move it away. Across the table, Nora caught her eye and smiled with entirely undisguised satisfaction. After supper, when the children had been put down to sleep on pallets in the back room, and the adults had retreated to the main room with whiskey for the men and rye tea for the women, Ira took Wilhelmina outside onto the porch because she had mentioned wanting to see the stars, which in December over the Oklahoma prairie were, it had to be said, absolutely extraordinary. They stood in the cold and looked up at the immense dark scatter of them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him gathering himself, not nervously but with the careful intention of a man who wants to say a thing correctly because the thing matters. "I know it has not been long," he said. 3 months is not long. But I have lived enough years and known enough people to know that what is between us is not a small thing and is not going to diminish." He paused. "I would like to marry you, Wilhelmina. Not because you are alone and it would be practical, though it would be practical, but because you are the most interesting and capable and genuine person I have met in my life, and because I love you, and because I would like the rest of my life to be spent in your company." The stars were there above them, and the cold was real, and the house behind them was full of the warmth and noise of people living together. And she stood in the space between the cold and the warmth, and looked at this man who argued honestly and held ladders and gave horses away and came back for them. And she thought that her father had wanted her to marry adequate, and she had refused it, and she had been right to refuse it because this was not adequate. This was something she had not known how to name until this moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you," he exhaled. She realized he had been more uncertain than he had appeared, more careful with hope than he'd let on, and that moved her as deeply as anything he'd said. He drew her close, and she came without hesitation, and they stood on the porch in the cold looking at the stars until Nora opened the door and said with cheerful impertinence that if the 2 of them were going to stand outside freezing, she at least wanted to know why. And when Ira told her, Nora made a noise that was somewhere between a cry and a laugh, and called for Cleet with an urgency that brought 3 people out of the house convinced something terrible had happened. It was not terrible at all. They were married in February of 1883, in the church in Danvers on a Saturday when the temperature had lifted enough to make the world seem willing again. The minister was a young man named Pryor who had only recently arrived in the territory and was visibly moved by the simplicity and directness of the vows, as well he might be, because Ira said his with a quality of clear intention that made several women present feel something go tight in their throats. Nora cried. Cleet put his arm around her and looked at the ceiling. Dix Farrow stood very straight and looked extremely serious. Wilhelmina wore the dress she had made herself through the December evenings, a deep blue wool with white buttons at the throat, and she had her dark hair pinned up under a small bonnet that her mother had left her years ago. She was not a vain woman, but she was aware, from the way Ira looked at her when she came down the church aisle on the arm of old Mr. Pickett who had volunteered for the role, that she looked well. She signed her name as Wilhelmina Norris for the first time in the register at the post office, which served the town's legal recording needs, and stood looking at it for a moment with the quiet feeling of something right. They moved her things to the ranch. The quarter section remained hers, the deed in her name, and they agreed that it would be farmed lightly for now and held against future need. Fletcher came to live with Clover in the paddock at the ranch. The chickens were a negotiation that Ira approached with admirable good humor, eventually constructing them their own expanded coop on the ranch property. The ranch house required some adaptation. Nora had opinions about this and offered them freely. Wilhelmina had her own opinions, which were not always the same as Nora's, and the two of them argued with great warmth and mutual respect until they arrived at arrangements that satisfied them both. The main bedroom got curtains. The kitchen got a second shelf. The sitting room got a rug from the back room, where it had been sitting rolled against the wall since Ira had bought it at an estate sale 2 years prior without being entirely sure what to do with it. "Why did you buy a rug and then not use it?" she asked him, the afternoon they unrolled it. "I bought it because I thought it was the kind of thing a house needed," he said. "But it felt wrong to put it down in a room where there was no one to appreciate it properly." She looked at him. "You bought a rug 2 years ago in anticipation of someone to appreciate it." "I bought a rug 2 years ago," he said carefully, "in the hope that at some point my situation might change." She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. Spring came to the Oklahoma Territory in 1883 with a generosity that felt like restitution for the dry years before it. The rains came right, and the grass grew tall and green, and the wildflowers came up on the ridges in sheets of color that you could see from a mile away, red and yellow, and a particular shade of purple that had no exact name. Wilhelmina planted her garden on the ranch property, and it thrived beyond what she had managed alone on the quarter section, because here there was more water and better soil, and she supposed, the simple energy that comes from not having to carry everything alone. She was learning the ranch in the way she had learned most things, by doing. Ira taught her without patronizing her, and she learned without performing gratitude. She did not entirely feel when he showed her something she had already figured out. They had, within a few months of marriage, arrived at an equilibrium that Nora called well-matched stubbornness, and that Wilhelmina preferred to call mutual competence. The cattle herd was 28 head when they married and grew to 40 by summer. Ira hired a third hand, a quiet young man from Texas named Samuel Price, who had worked on the Kishom Trail for 2 seasons and was looking for something steadier. He was respectful and hardworking, and seemed somewhat amazed to find himself employed by a married couple who discussed ranch decisions together at the breakfast table, but he adapted to it quickly. In July, Wilhelmina discovered she was expecting. She had suspected for several weeks before she was certain, and she told Ira on a Monday evening after supper, at the table with the last of the daylight coming through the window. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face and saw something move through it that she had not seen before, a complicated fullness, as if a room that had been merely comfortable had suddenly been lit by more windows than expected. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely well," she said. "Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand. "Good." He held her hand and they sat like that in the evening light, and she thought that there was nothing she needed to add to this moment because it was already complete. In August, a piece of news reached Danvers that moved through the territory like weather. Gerald Hatch and his development company had been exposed in a scheme in which forged land deeds had been used to claim properties from which the actual owners had not in fact sold. 3 families north of Danvers had been affected. The case had been brought before the territorial court, and Hatch was facing significant legal consequences. His company was dissolved. Wilhelmina heard about it from Nora, who had heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who had heard it from the postmaster. She was in the kitchen when Nora told her, and she set down her mixing spoon, and felt a clean, deep satisfaction that she did not try to suppress. When she told Ira that evening, he nodded in the way he did when something had resolved in the direction it should have. "Hatch was always going to go too far," he said. "Men like that always do. The families who lost their land," she said. "Can they recover it?" "The court is working on that," he said. "I imagine they can if the deeds were forged. Forged deeds are no deeds at all." It was not a clean outcome, she knew. The frontier rarely offered clean outcomes. The families would have their land back, presumably, but they had lost months of work and certainty, and that at a cost that no court could fully address. The territory was a place where injustice moved quietly under the surface of ordinary life, and you had to keep your eyes open, and you had to hold your ground, and sometimes holding your ground was itself a form of justice. She had held hers. So had Ira. So had others. It was not a heroic story. It was just the particular labor of surviving in a place that required it. The baby came in late February of 1884, and it was a boy. They named him James, after Ira's father, in the spirit of the peace that Ira had wished he could have fully made with the old man before he died. James Norris came into the world on a cold, clear morning with his father holding Wilhelmina's hand, and Nora serving as midwife with the competent efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew it was a process that benefited from calm. He was loud. This surprised her. She had not known what to expect, but she had not expected the sheer, robust volume of his announcing himself. Ira looked at his son with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was beyond happiness, something more essential, more fundamental, the look of a man who has understood something about life that cannot be communicated in words. "He is loud," Ira said. "He takes after his mother," Nora said, who then had to leave the room because Wilhelmina threw a folded cloth at her. The year that followed was the fullest and most demanding of Wilhelmina's life, which was saying something because her life had not lacked for demand. A baby, a ranch, a husband, 40 head of cattle, 3 ranch hands, a vegetable garden that she was not willing to let go to ruin simply because she had a child, and the general ongoing negotiation of a shared life with a person who was, thank God, a sensible and capable person, but was still a different person with different instincts and ways of doing things. They argued sometimes. Real arguments, with raised voices and the careful aftermath of coming back together and examining what had happened. Their first significant argument was about the quarter section. Ira thought they should lease it to a neighboring family who had expressed interest. Wilhelmina did not want to let someone else work her father's land, even for income. They went back and forth on it for a week, each laying out their position with the honest arguing she had once admired in him and now occasionally found quite aggravating, until she understood that her objection was not practical but emotional, and that was fine, but it needed to be named as such. She named it. He understood. They did not lease the land. Instead, they planted it in winter wheat, which required less supervision than a vegetable garden and less livestock management than cattle, and it produced a modest but real income the following year that felt like her father's land contributing to the life she had built. James grew in the way that babies grow when they are well-loved and well-fed, which is to say at an alarming pace. By spring, he was rolling. By summer, he was pulling himself up against the furniture and regarding the world from this new height with the deep seriousness of a small person who has grasped that vertical is better. Ira held him in the evenings after supper with the particular ease of a man who is surprised to find himself good at something, and James regarded his father with enormous solemn eyes and occasionally reached up to grab his jaw with both hands, which Ira bore with complete dignity. Clover, in the fall of 1884, threw a foal. The father was a fine quarter-horse stallion from a ranch 20 miles east whose owner Ira had negotiated with the previous spring. The foal was a colt, dark bay with a white star on his forehead, and he stood on impossible-looking legs within an hour of birth and looked at the world with the same bold interest that Clover had shown on the morning she arrived at Wilhelmina's fence post 2 years before. Wilhelmina stood at the paddock fence looking at the foal and thought about the morning she had found Clover there, the way the horse had stood so patiently in the early light, the way something so small as a stray animal had been the thread that pulled everything into place. She thought about Ira standing on his porch telling her to keep the horse, the careful look on his face, the honest thing he had said about wanting a reason to come for her. She heard him come up behind her and felt his hands on her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The morning I found Clover at my fence," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The best morning of my year." "She was missing for 2 days," she said. "You must have been half sick with worry." "I was worried about the horse," he said. "But when I saw you come through the gate with her, I stopped worrying about the horse entirely." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the foal with that steady expression of his. "You had no idea who I was," she said. "No," he said. "But you were holding the reins of my horse, and you had ridden 5 miles to return her, and you were covered in the red dust of the Ridge Road, and you looked at me like you were expecting me to be exactly who I was, no more and no less." He paused. "That is not a small thing." She took his hand, which was still on her shoulder, and held it. "What will you name the foal?" she asked. "I thought James might have an opinion about that," he said. "When he is old enough to have one," she laughed. "He is 11 months old." "He has strong opinions about his porridge already," Ira said. "I see no reason to underestimate him." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a hard one in the territory. Not as hard as the winter of 1880 that old-timers still spoke of with a particular quietness, but hard enough that the cattle required constant attention, and the water troughs froze every morning and had to be broken open with an axe, and the winds came across the open prairie with a force that made the house creak in the night and woke James, which meant it woke Wilhelmina, which meant it woke Ira, and all 3 of them were frequently underprepared for morning by the time it arrived. But they managed. They managed because they had supplies enough and hands enough in each other, and because managing difficult things together has a way of deepening a bond past the point where any ordinary circumstance could threaten it. Nora came over twice a week during the worst of it because her children were old enough to entertain themselves in bad weather, and she said frankly that she needed something to do or she would lose her mind. And her presence was so entirely welcome that Wilhelmina said nothing about the fact that it was really Nora who needed the visiting and not Wilhelmina who needed the help. In February, exactly 2 years after James was born, a letter arrived from Kansas City. It was addressed to Ira and was from a lawyer representing the estate of a man named Thomas Norris, who was Ira's uncle on his father's side and who had died the previous November. The uncle had left Ira a sum of $600 and a small portable writing desk that had belonged to Ira's grandfather. $600 was a significant sum. They sat at the table for a long time after reading the letter and did not immediately speak. "Your uncle," she said. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough," Ira said. "He was a bachelor, a schoolteacher for most of his life. He came to visit us twice when I was a boy." He was quiet and read a great deal and always brought books as gifts, which my father approved of and I found intermittently interesting. He looked at the letter again. I did not know he had this kind of money. School teachers and bachelors have fewer things to spend money on, she said. Apparently, he folded the letter. What do you think we should do with it? She had already been thinking. The south fence line needs replacing. That is perhaps $40. We could expand the herd. If we bought 12 or 15 head of good stock now, in 2 years they would return 3 times the investment. She paused. And I would like to hire a teacher for this area. He looked at her. A teacher. The schoolhouse in Danver is 5 miles away, she said. There are 8 children within 3 miles of this ranch, including Nora's 3. James will be school age in 4 years. I would like there to be a proper school closer than Danver, and I would like there to be a teacher in it who is paid enough to stay. He was quiet for a moment. How much would that cost? A year's salary for a teacher, plus the materials to build a small schoolhouse on the north edge of Danver, where the land is cheap. $200 perhaps, maybe less if people contribute labor. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know as his particular response to being surprised by her, which was not shock but a kind of deepened attention, as if she had done something that required a revised understanding of what she was capable of. You have been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since James was born, she said. He nodded once. The fence, the cattle, and the school, he said. That leaves room for the unexpected. It always has to leave room for the unexpected, she said. That is one thing the frontier teaches reliably. They put the plan in motion in the spring of 1885. The fence was replaced with good post and wire that would last 20 years. 14 head of cattle were purchased from a reliable seller in Wichita, and the school was a project that took on its own momentum once people heard about it. The men of the surrounding farms and ranches came on 3 consecutive Saturdays and built a schoolhouse of solid timber on the north edge of Danver that seated 20 children at good desks. And Wilhelmina and Nora organized the women's contributions of materials and food for the working days. And there was a quality of collective purpose to the whole enterprise that felt, to Wilhelmina, like the territory at its best. The teacher was a young woman from Missouri named Clara Webb, 22 years old, with round glasses and a great deal of quiet determination. She arrived on the eastbound stage from Wichita in August of 1885 and was met by Wilhelmina, who had arranged her hire through a teacher's college in Kansas City. Clara Webb looked at the territory with the expression of someone who had been told what to expect and found the reality both more and less than the description. She was excellent with children and had a particular gift for mathematics, and within 3 weeks of her arrival, she had the school running with a discipline and energy that impressed even the most skeptical of the parents. Wilhelmina liked her immediately. So did Nora. Dix Farrow, who had grown into a thoughtful and reliable young man of 23, liked her in a different way that was obvious to everyone except, apparently, to Clara Webb herself. And this situation provided Nora with a great deal of entertainment through the fall of 1885. But this is a separate story, or the beginning of one, and it belongs to Dix and Clara, not to Ira and Wilhelmina. The autumn of 1885 was the autumn when Wilhelmina understood, with full clarity and without reservation, that she had built what she had wanted to build. Not perfectly, because nothing is perfect, and not without cost, because nothing is without cost, but truly. She had her father's land and her husband's land and a child and a good life, and a community of people she had made herself into, none of it handed to her, but all of it real and hers. She understood it one morning in October, standing at the paddock fence with her coffee, while Ira was out in the south pasture with Samuel and the cattle. James was inside with Nora, who had come to mind him for the morning. The light was long and gold, and the grass was the color it gets in autumn in that part of Oklahoma, a deep tawny gold that holds the sun. Clover was at the fence, and Wilhelmina gave her an apple from the pocket of her coat, the way she often did, and the mare took it with the delicate efficiency of an animal that has been well treated and expects to continue to be. She thought about the morning she had found Clover at her fence, the way the horse had stood there as if she had somewhere specific to be and had chosen this place. She thought about the 5 miles to Ira's ranch and the coffee and bread, and the way he had looked at her across the table. She thought about a horse given away and a reason invented to come back. She had said, "Tell me why," and he had said, "I want a reason to come for her." She had not known on that September morning that she was riding toward her whole life. That was the nature of things, she supposed. You never know. You get on your horse in the morning and you ride toward what seems like a simple errand, and it turns out to be the errand you were made for. Ira came in at midday. He left his horse with Samuel and came up to the porch where Wilhelmina was sitting with James on her lap, the boy absorbed in the serious work of trying to untie the ribbon on her dress pocket. Ira sat down beside them and took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair that was darker with dust from the morning's work. "How is the south fence holding?" she asked. "Better than last year," he said. "The new wire was worth it." "I told you." "You did," he said. James abandoned the ribbon and transferred his attention to his father's hat, which he had apparently decided was required. Ira let him have it. It fell down over the boy's eyes and he pushed it back with both hands and looked out at the world from under the brim with an expression of enormous self-satisfaction. "He is going to want a real hat," Ira said. "He is too," Wilhelmina said. "2-year-olds need hats," Ira said. "It is cold in November." She looked at them together, the man and the boy, the hat passing between them in the easy way of something shared, and felt the full weight of her life pressing warmly against her from all directions. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "James is going to have a brother or sister," she said. He was still for a moment, and then the same complicated fullness she had seen on his face 2 years ago moved through it again, that look of a room lit by unexpected windows. "When?" he asked. "April, I think," she said. "Maybe May." He reached over and took her hand, and James, from under the hat brim, watched this maneuver with the critical eye of a child who suspects his parents of conducting activities that do not include him. "Papa," James said, with the authority of a boy who has been talking for 6 months and is still surprised by how effective it is. "Yes," Ira said to his son without taking his eyes off Wilhelmina. "Hat," James said, and held it out. Ira took the hat and put it back on his own head and picked his son up and held him against his chest, and looked at Wilhelmina with a steadiness and warmth that had been there from the beginning and had only deepened with time, the way a river deepens in the same channel the longer it runs. "Are you well?" he asked, the same thing he had asked 2 years ago. "Entirely well," she said, the same answer. The spring of 1886 came early and warm, and in the last days of April, Wilhelmina delivered a daughter without significant difficulty, and with Nora present in the capable and cheerful way that Nora was always present for difficult things. The girl was fair where James was dark and had Wilhelmina's eyes and Ira's particular steadiness of expression from the very first day. They named her Mare, after Wilhelmina's mother, who had died when Wilhelmina was 9 years old, and whom she remembered in the way you remember someone you loved young, in fragments of warmth and specific sensory details, the smell of her coat, the sound of her voice saying her full name with varying degrees of patience. James regarded his sister with the cautious interest of a child encountering something completely new to his experience, which was most things at his age, and within a week had developed the protective instinct of an older brother, which expressed itself primarily as standing very close to the basket she slept in and reporting to the nearest adult whenever she made any sound at all. "James," Ira said one afternoon when the boy had come to report the baby making a face he had not seen before, "she is fine." "She made a face," James said. "Babies make faces," Ira said. "You made faces, extraordinary faces. Your mother has descriptions of them." "I made good faces," James said, with the certainty of a child who has heard the adults laugh too long at something he said to believe it was not good. Wilhelmina was in the kitchen when she heard this exchange, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing, because James's expression of absolute conviction was one of her favorite things in the world. The summer moved on. The ranch grew. The Norris herd reached 60 head by August, and Ira began talking about taking on a fourth hand in the spring. Samuel Price had turned out to be one of those quiet men whose value only becomes fully clear over time, steady and skilled and loyal in the way of someone who has found his place. And Cleet and Dix were as reliable as ever. Dix increasingly so now that he had his own private source of motivation in the form of Clara Webb, who had apparently noticed him at some point in the preceding spring. The schoolhouse served 32 children by the fall of 1886. Clara had a helper now, a young man of 17 who was too old for school himself, but who came 3 mornings a week to assist with the youngest children while he finished his own education on the side. The school had become a thing the community owned and was proud of, and on the occasions when people spoke of its founding, Wilhelmina's name was mentioned as the one who had insisted on it, which she found slightly embarrassing and entirely gratifying. On a cool evening in October of 1886, Ira and Wilhelmina sat together on the porch after the children were asleep. He had his coffee and she had hers, and they were watching the stars come out in the way they often did in the evenings, this being one of the more reliable pleasures of living where they lived. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think about how close I came to not seeing you," he said. The fence on the south pasture had been weak for a month before Clover got through it. I kept meaning to fix it and not getting to it. If I had fixed it the week before, she would not have gotten out and you would have had no reason to come. I would have found some other reason eventually, she said. He looked at her sideways. You did not know I existed. No, she said, but I would have ridden northeast at some point. The land draws you. She paused. I would have come over the ridge eventually and you would have been at your fence and we would have met. You are very certain of that. I am certain of outcomes, she said. The paths are various, but the outcomes have a weight to them. He considered this. My father would have said that was theology. Perhaps it is, she said. Or perhaps it is just what living long enough in one place teaches you. Things connect. Not always neatly, but they connect. He reached over and took her hand in the easy way of people who have been reaching for each other long enough that it requires no thought. Below them in the paddock, Clover moved in the dark, the soft sound of her hooves on the ground, and somewhere in the barn James's foal, whom James had ultimately named Captain with complete seriousness after much consideration, shifted in his stall. The night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the land lay quiet around them in every direction, the grass and the ridge and the red dirt road running south toward Danver and north toward open prairie, and there were lights in the bunkhouse window where Cleet and Nora's kids were being put to bed, and somewhere east of the ridge the lights of a few other farms showed like grounded stars, and it was all, she thought, entirely real and entirely right. I am glad the fence was weak, she said. So am I, he said. I am glad Clover came to my fence post, she said. She always had good judgment, he said. She laughed. The laugh went out into the dark and disappeared in the way sounds do in open country, absorbed by the vast indifference of the land. And she did not mind this at all because the laugh had been real, and the moment had been real, and both of those things were enough. She thought about the morning she had come down the ridge road with Clover's reins in her hand, and the red dust of the road on her coat and her hair coming loose from its pins, and a man she had never met coming out of his barn with a hammer in his hand, and the whole ordinary, extraordinary improbability of it. And she thought that she would not have changed a single step of it, not the 2 years alone on her father's land, not the grief and the hard winters, not the doubt, not the adequate merchant from Wichita whom she had declined, not any of it, because all of it had been the road that led to this porch and this man and these stars. The winter of 1886 into 1887 passed quietly. Mary learned to pull herself up in her crib and regarded the world with the same calm certainty she had shown from birth. James turned 3 in February and received from his father a small hat of his own, a real one sized for a child, which he wore constantly, including, on 2 occasions, in bed. Clara Webb and Dix Farrow announced their engagement in March, which surprised no one except possibly Dix, who seemed somewhat amazed to have arrived at this outcome, and pleased in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of people who have gotten exactly what they wanted without fully expecting it. In April, Nora arrived at the ranch with 3 things: a pot of beef stew, her youngest child on her hip, and the news that the railroad was confirmed to be coming through territory and would have a station in Danvers by the following year. "Land prices," Nora said, setting the stew on the stove with the authority of someone who is absolutely right about something and would like it noted. "Land prices," Wilhelmina agreed. They sat at the table and talked about it. The railroad coming was not a simple good. It would bring opportunity, the ability to sell cattle at better prices without driving them to distant markets, the ability to receive goods faster and cheaper, the connection to the wider world that frontier isolation always made costly. But it would also bring people, more people, the kind of rapid settlement that changed the character of a place, and it would increase the pressure on land values in a way that might eventually bring another Gerald Hatch, or several of them. "We hold what we have," Ira said when she put this to him that evening. "And we keep our eyes open," she said. "We keep our eyes open," he agreed. This had become, without either of them naming it as such, their approach to most things. Hold what matters, keep your eyes open, work with full attention, be honest, find reasons to come back. The railroad came to Danvers in October of 1887, and the first train came through on a Tuesday morning, and the whole town came out to see it, which Wilhelmina thought was entirely appropriate. She stood on the platform with James holding her hand and Mary on her hip, and the train came around the bend trailing its white smoke, and announced itself with a sound that James found so extraordinary that he stopped making any sound of his own, and simply watched with huge eyes. Ira stood beside her, and she leaned slightly into him in the unconscious way of people who have stood beside each other long enough that the proximity is simply where they naturally incline. "Change," she said. "Always," he said. "Good change mostly," she said. "Mostly," he said, "with work." James tugged her hand. "Mama," he said, "the train." "I see it," she said. "It is very large," James said with the tone of someone sharing important new information. "It is," she agreed. She looked at the train and looked at her son and looked at her husband and held her daughter, who was regarding the train with the calm, unimpressed gaze of a 1-year-old, who has not yet been informed that she is supposed to be amazed. And the morning was bright and clear and full of the noise and smoke of the future arriving, and Wilhelmina Norris, who had been Wilhelmina Vaughn, who had ridden 5 miles on a September morning 2 years in the past to return a stray horse to a stranger and come home with something she had not known she was looking for, stood in all of it and felt the full weight of her life, good and real and entirely her own. They rode home from town together in the wagon, the children between them on the seat, James talking without pause about the train and Mary asleep against her father's arm, and the road ran north through the gold October grass toward the ridge and over it, and down toward the ranch where the smoke from the house chimney was already visible, some small sign of Nora having been in to tend the stove in their absence, because that was the kind of person Nora was. "Ira," Wilhelmina said, over the top of James's continuing monologue about trains. He said, not taking his eyes from the road. "You know that thing you said," she said, "about wanting a reason to come for the horse?" He glanced at her. "I have been thinking," she said, "that you never needed a reason, you just needed to know there was something worth coming for." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled through the gold grass, and James had temporarily run out of observations about trains and was now examining something on his shoe. "You are right," Ira said. "I knew it from the first minute." "So did I," she said. "I just needed to let myself know it." He reached across their son and found her hand and held it, and she held back, and the road curved toward the ridge, and the sky was blue and enormous overhead, and the grass moved in the wind in long, soft waves, and the smoke from the chimney drew a thin white line against the sky ahead of them, pointing home. They had good years after that. Years of work and growth and the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of a life built and maintained by two people who understood each other and chose each other again each day in the small, continued ways that choice expresses itself. The coffee made before the other wakes, the patience held when it is difficult to hold, the argument pursued honestly, and the peace made after it, the hand found in the dark. James grew into a boy who was serious and curious in equal measure, and who by the age of 5 was already showing the particular interest in the animals that would define him, spending hours at the paddock fence watching Clover and Captain, and the other horses with an intensity of attention that reminded Wilhelmina, with a fullness in her chest, of Ira watching the foal on the morning after its birth. Mary grew into a child who was, by general consensus, completely fearless. She had no interest in being carried once she could walk, and no interest in being watched once she could manage alone. By the time she was 2, she had earned Nora's description of a small woman who knows exactly what she is about, which Wilhelmina accepted as the highest of compliments. The school expanded. Clara Webb, who was Clara Farrow now since the wedding in June of 1887, taught for 4 years before she and Dix had their own child, and she stepped back. But by then the school had 2 teachers and a reputation for quality that drew families to the area who might have gone elsewhere. Wilhelmina had been on the school's small governing board since its founding, a role she took with the same combination of warmth and firm practicality she brought to everything. The quarter section was planted in winter wheat for 4 years, and then, when the price of wheat declined, and the territory began filling with grain farmers who could do it at greater scale, she and Ira converted it to a pasture lease, renting the grazing rights to a family of sheep farmers who came through in 1889 with a flock and needed land, and proved to be good neighbors. The income from the lease was modest but steady, and she kept the deed in her own name, and paid the taxes from the ranch accounts, and felt, every year when she looked at it, that her father's land was doing something useful and would continue to. On a September evening in 1889, which was an important year in the territory because Oklahoma was open to settlement in the great land run that spring, and the territory was transforming with a speed and chaos that astonished everyone who witnessed it, Ira and Wilhelmina stood at the paddock fence together in the last of the evening light. James was 6 now, and had his own place beside them at the fence, watching the horses with the same patient attention he had shown since he could stand. Mary was 3 and was riding on her father's shoulders with the absolute confidence of a child who is certain she is in the safest possible place. Clover was at the fence. She was 7 now in the full strength of a mature horse, and she put her head over the rail in the way she always did, expecting the apple she usually received, and Wilhelmina gave it to her out of her coat pocket. "She knows," James said. "Knows what?" Wilhelmina asked. "That she belongs here," James said. "You can tell by the way she comes to the fence. Animals know where they belong." Ira looked at his son over Mary's head and then looked at Wilhelmina with an expression that was full and quiet and deeply glad. "He is right," Ira said. "He usually is," Wilhelmina said. Clover finished the apple and blew a warm breath across Wilhelmina's hand and turned back to the grass, perfectly at ease. Captain was at the far end of the paddock, grazing in the long shadow. The land lay around them in the last gold of the September evening, and the sky above the ridge was the color of deep water, and the first stars were just becoming visible. Mary said from her father's shoulders, "More stars." "They are just coming out," Ira told her. "Wait." They waited. The stars came, one by one, and then many at once in the way of the prairie sky, which does not merely contain stars but is generous with them. And the 4 of them stood at the fence in the evening dark looking up at the enormous clear sky of the territory, the man and the woman and their children, the horses moving quietly behind them, the house behind them with its windows lit, and all around them the land that they had worked and kept and filled with the living evidence of their days. Wilhelmina reached for Ira's hand and found it without looking, the way she always found it and held it, and the stars continued their patient and ancient accumulation overhead, and the October wind moved through the grass, and everything was resolved and right and wholly, richly theirs.